There are moments in history when a man's survival defies every logical explanation, when witnesses swear to what they saw, yet no one can understand how it happened. In a remote plantation in Georgia, 1847, a wealthy landowner named Baron Wilhelm Vanir devised what he believed would be the perfect punishment for a slave who had embarrassed him in front of distinguished guests. The plan was simple, brutal and foolproof. Lock the man inside a reinforced pen with 6 of the most aggressive bulls on the property. Bulls that had gored 3 men to death in the past 2 years. Bulls that attacked anything that moved. The Baron gave explicit orders. The slave would remain there for 3 days without food or water. If he survived, he would earn his freedom. But no one expected him to last 3 hours. What happened next became the most disturbing mystery in the county's history, because when they opened that pen 72 hours later, the slave walked out unharmed, and behind him all 6 bulls followed like obedient dogs. Not just followed, they refused to leave his side. They became docile, almost protective, and within 2 weeks, 14 more bulls from neighboring properties began appearing at the plantation gates, calm and submissive, seeking only one thing, to be near that man. 20 bulls, all following him, all transformed. The Baron never spoke of it again. 3 months later, he was found dead in his study, the door locked from the inside, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. And the slave? He vanished the same night, taking nothing with him, except, according to 7 witnesses, a procession of 20 bulls that walked silently behind him into the darkness of the Georgia woods. This is the story of what really happened in that pen, and why, to this day, no one has ever been able to explain it. Before we continue with the story of Tobias and the 20 bulls that followed him into legend, let me take a moment to ask you something. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most unsettling mysteries, please consider subscribing to the channel. We bring you stories like this every week, tales that blur the line between documented history and inexplicable phenomena. Hit that like button if you want to see more, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, let's go back to Georgia, 1847, and discover what truly happened on Baron Vandermeer's plantation. Georgia in the 1840s was a place where power was measured in land and labor. The plantation system had reached its peak, and men like Baron Wilhelm Vanir represented the absolute authority of that world. Vandermeer wasn't born in America. He had arrived from the Netherlands in 1829 with a fortune made in the spice trade and a reputation for ruthless business practices that had made him wealthy but despised in European circles. Rumors followed him across the Atlantic. Whispers of exploited workers in Java, of ships that disappeared carrying valuable cargo, of business partners who had mysteriously died just before major deals were finalized. None of it was ever proven, but the pattern was clear enough that respectable Dutch society had quietly closed its doors to him. America, particularly the American South, offered Vandermeer something Europe no longer could. A place where questions about a man's past were considered impolite, where wealth spoke louder than reputation, and where the social structure allowed men of means to exercise almost unlimited power over those beneath them. He purchased a sprawling estate near the town of Valdosta in southern Georgia, transforming it into one of the most profitable cotton plantations in the region. The property encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of prime agricultural land, bordered by dense pine forests to the east and the Withlacoochee River to the west. But Vandermeer had another obsession beyond cotton: cattle. Specifically, bulls. He had developed this fixation during his years in Spain, where he had witnessed bullfighting and become fascinated by the animal's raw power and aggression. He began importing European breeding stock, particularly aggressive bull breeds used in Spain and Portugal for fighting. He believed these animals represented strength and dominance, qualities he valued above all else. His collection of bulls became legendary in the county, and feared. Workers whispered about the devil's herd, bulls so vicious they had killed 3 men who had attempted to handle them. The first death had occurred in 1845. A worker named Henry, who had experience with cattle from his previous plantation, had been tasked with moving one of the bulls to a different pen. The bull, a massive grey beast Vandermeer had named Titan, had seemed calm at first. But the moment Henry entered the pen with a lead rope, Titan charged. The attack was so sudden and violent that the other workers watching couldn't react in time. By the time they managed to distract the bull and pull Henry's body out, he was already dead, his chest crushed, several ribs broken and driven into his lungs. The second death came 6 months later. A young man named Peter, barely 20 years old, had been ordered to feed the bulls. He had approached the pen cautiously, sliding the feed through a gap in the fence as he'd been instructed. But one of the bulls, a black beast with scarred flanks that Vandermeer called Goliath, had somehow managed to force its head through the gap, catching Peter's arm in its jaws. The bull had pulled with such force that Peter was dragged against the fence, his shoulder dislocating, his arm breaking in 3 places. Other workers had rushed to help, but in the chaos Peter had fallen and struck his head against a fence post. He died 2 days later, never regaining consciousness, his arm so badly mangled that the plantation's doctor said even if he had survived, he would have lost the limb. The third death was the most disturbing. A man named Samuel, who had worked with livestock for over 15 years and was considered one of the most experienced handlers on the property, had been tasked with treating an injury on one of the bulls. The animal had gotten a deep cut on its leg, and Vandermeer wanted it treated to prevent infection. Samuel had approached carefully, speaking softly to the bull, moving slowly. He had managed to get close enough to examine the wound. But when he touched the bull's leg, the animal had exploded into violence. It had reared up, its hooves catching Samuel in the chest and head. The other workers had managed to pull Samuel out, but he had died within minutes, his skull fractured, blood pouring from his ears and nose. After Samuel's death, Vandermeer had the pen reinforced with additional iron bars and thicker posts. He also decreed that no worker was to enter the pen under any circumstances. The bulls would be fed from outside through specially designed chutes. Water would be provided through troughs that could be filled from a safe distance. The bulls would live in that pen, isolated and dangerous, a testament to Vandermeer's wealth and his ability to maintain something that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his power. The plantation itself was a world unto itself. Over 200 people lived and worked there, most of them enslaved, their lives controlled entirely by Vandermeer's whims. The main house was a grand structure built in the Greek Revival style that was popular among wealthy Southerners of the era. White columns, wide verandas, tall windows designed to catch any breeze during the brutal summer months. The house sat on a slight rise, positioned so that Vandermeer could look out from his second-floor study and see the entire plantation spread before him. The cotton fields stretching toward the horizon, the worker quarters arranged in neat rows, the barns and storage buildings, and far to the east, the bullpen, a dark square against the tree line. Vandermeer ruled with calculated cruelty. He was not a man who beat his slaves himself. He considered such behavior beneath his dignity, the mark of someone who had lost control. Instead, he employed an overseer named Dalton, a lean, hard man from South Carolina who had a reputation for efficiency and brutality. Dalton handled the physical enforcement of discipline, while Vandermeer orchestrated the psychological control. He believed in making examples, in creating situations where people would humiliate themselves or each other, in fostering an environment of fear and uncertainty where no one could ever feel secure. He would, for instance, announce that he was considering granting freedom to one of the enslaved workers, then spend weeks having different people audition for the privilege, performing tasks or answering questions, building hope, only to ultimately declare that none of them had proven worthy. Or he would pit workers against each other, promising rewards to whoever produced the most cotton in a week, then finding reasons to disqualify the winner and give the reward to someone else entirely. These games served no purpose beyond his own amusement and the maintenance of absolute control. His wife, Margaret, was a quiet woman who had come from a respectable Dutch family that had fallen on hard times. She had married Vanir more out of necessity than affection. Her family needed the financial security he could provide, and he wanted the social legitimacy that came with marrying into an old European family. She spent most of her time in the main house, managing the household staff, reading and writing letters to family members back in the Netherlands. She rarely spoke about her husband's business practices, and when she did, it was always in the most general, diplomatic terms. Those who knew her well, her personal maid, the cook, a few of the house servants, whispered that she was deeply unhappy, that she often cried in her private chambers, that she had once tried to leave but had been convinced or threatened into staying. The plantation's social structure was complex and carefully maintained. At the top sat Vanir and his wife, then a small tier of white overseers and managers, then skilled workers, some enslaved, some free blacks who worked for wages, then field workers, and at the very bottom, those who had been designated as troublemakers or were being punished. Movement between these tiers was rare and entirely at Vanir's discretion. Among the enslaved population was a man named Tobias. No one knew his age exactly. He appeared to be in his 30s, though his eyes suggested someone much older. He had been purchased at auction in Savannah 5 years earlier, part of a group brought from a plantation in South Carolina that had gone bankrupt after a series of bad harvests and poor investments. The auction records listed him simply as Tobias male, approximately 30 years, field hand, no known family. But those who had traveled with him from South Carolina told a different story. They said Tobias had been different from the moment they'd known him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He had a way of looking at people that made them uncomfortable, as if he could see past whatever face they were presenting to the world and into something deeper. Some of the other enslaved people from South Carolina different from the moment they'd known him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He had a way of looking at people that made them uncomfortable, as if he could see past whatever face they were presenting to the world and into something deeper. Some of the other enslaved people from South Carolina claimed that Tobias had been born in Africa, that he had been brought over as a child and still remembered the old ways, the old languages, the old beliefs. Others said he had been born in America but had been taught by someone who knew those things. A few whispered that he wasn't entirely human, that he was something else wearing a human shape. But these whispers were always quickly silenced. Such talk was dangerous, the kind of thing that could get people accused of practicing forbidden religions or planning rebellions. What everyone agreed on was that Tobias had a strange gift with animals. Horses that were skittish and difficult to manage would calm in his presence. Dogs that barked at everyone else would sit quietly when he approached. Even wild animals seemed to react differently to him. Workers reported seeing him stand perfectly still in the fields while deer grazed nearby, unafraid or watching as birds would land on his shoulders and arms as if he were a tree. When Vanir had purchased Tobias, he had initially assigned him to field work. But within a week, the stable master, an older free black man named Marcus, had requested that Tobias be reassigned to work with the horses. Marcus had noticed Tobias's effect on the animals and recognized it as something valuable. Vanir had agreed, always willing to maximize efficiency, and Tobias had been moved to the stables. For 5 years Tobias had worked there quietly and competently. He cared for the horses, maintained the tack and equipment, and occasionally assisted with other livestock when needed. He lived in a small room attached to the stable, separate from the main worker quarters. This isolation suited him. He spent his evenings alone, and on Sundays, when most of the enslaved population gathered for the supervised religious services Vanir allowed, believing that controlled religion kept people docile, Tobias would disappear into the woods, returning only after dark. Some people found this behavior suspicious. Dalton, the overseer, had questioned Tobias about it several times, demanding to know what he was doing in the woods. Tobias had always given the same answer: walking, thinking, praying. It wasn't enough to punish him for. He wasn't breaking any explicit rules. but it marked him as someone to watch. Marcus, the stable master, was one of the few people Tobias spoke to with any regularity. Marcus was in his 60s, a man who had been born into slavery but had purchased his freedom 20 years earlier through a combination of saved wages and a generous loan from a Quaker merchant who opposed slavery. He had chosen to stay in the South and work for wages, sending money to family members who were still enslaved, hoping to eventually buy their freedom as well. He was a careful man, someone who had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of Southern society without making waves. Marcus had tried on several occasions to draw Tobias out, to learn more about him. But Tobias remained guarded. The most Marcus had ever gotten from him was a single conversation. Late one night when both men were working in the stable, treating a horse that had developed a bad cough. "You've got a gift," Marcus had said, watching as Tobias held his hand on the horse's neck, the animal's breathing gradually steadying. "I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never seen anyone with a touch like yours." Tobias had been silent for a long moment. Then he'd said, quietly, "It's not a gift. It's understanding." "Understanding what?" "That they're not so different from us. They feel fear. They feel pain. They want to be safe. If you understand that, really understand it, they know. They can tell." Marcus had nodded slowly. "Where'd you learn that?" Tobias had looked at him then, and Marcus had felt that uncomfortable sensation that others had described, the feeling of being seen too clearly. "From someone who understood it better than I do," Tobias had said. "Someone who's gone now." He hadn't elaborated, and Marcus hadn't pushed, but the conversation had stayed with him. There was something about Tobias that didn't quite fit the world they lived in. He was too calm, too centered, too unafraid in a place where fear was the primary tool of control. Vanir had noticed Tobias's gift as well, though he interpreted it differently. He saw it as a useful skill, something to be exploited. He had used Tobias several times to handle difficult livestock, always with success. But he also viewed it with suspicion. Vanir didn't like things he couldn't understand, and Tobias's effect on animals felt like something beyond normal skill. It suggested a kind of power, and Vanir couldn't tolerate the idea of anyone on his plantation having power that didn't come directly from him. This tension had been building for 5 years, unspoken but present. And then came the incident that would change everything. The incident that led to Tobias's punishment happened on a warm April evening in 1847. Vanir was hosting a dinner for several prominent plantation owners from neighboring counties. These gatherings were important to him. They were opportunities to display his wealth, to reinforce his position in the social hierarchy, to make business connections and political alliances. He had been planning this particular dinner for weeks, ensuring that every detail would be perfect. The guest list included some of the most powerful men in southern Georgia. There was Colonel James Hartley, who owned a plantation twice the size of Vandermeer's and had connections to the state legislature. There was Richard Brennan, a wealthy merchant who controlled much of the cotton trade in the region. There was Thomas Fairfax, a lawyer who had successfully defended several plantation owners in legal disputes over property and labor. And there were their wives, elegant women in expensive dresses, who would spend the evening discussing fashion and gossip while the men talked business. The dinner itself was elaborate. Vanir had ordered his cook, an enslaved woman named Ruth who had trained in Charleston and was known for her skill with French cuisine, to prepare a feast. Roasted duck, venison, fresh fish from the river, vegetables from the plantation's gardens, imported wines, elaborate desserts. The dining room had been decorated with flowers and candles, the silver polished until it gleamed, the crystal glasses arranged precisely. The dinner went well. The food was praised, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation was lively. Vanir held court at the head of the table, telling stories about his travels in Europe and Asia, making jokes at the expense of northern abolitionists, discussing the latest political developments in Washington. He was in his element, performing for an audience that appreciated his wealth and power. After dinner, as was customary, the men retired to Vandermeer's study for brandy and cigars, while the women remained in the parlor. It was during this time that Vandermeer made his mistake. He had been drinking heavily, feeling expansive and confident, and he decided to give his guests a tour of his prized bulls. "Gentlemen," he announced, standing and gesturing toward the window, "I have something to show you that I guarantee you've never seen before. The most magnificent and dangerous bulls in all of Georgia, perhaps in all of America." The men followed him outside, carrying their brandy glasses, laughing and talking. It was a pleasant evening, the air warm but not oppressive, a light breeze carrying the scent of jasmine from the gardens. They walked across the grounds, past the worker quarters where people watched silently from windows and doorways, past the cotton fields where the plants were just beginning to show their first growth, toward the eastern edge of the property where the bull pen stood. The pen was an impressive structure, built to contain animals that most men wouldn't dare approach. The fence was constructed of thick wooden posts, each one sunk 4 feet into the ground and reinforced with iron bars. The posts were spaced close together, too close for even a determined bull to force its way through. The gate was equally formidable, made of heavy timber and secured with multiple iron chains and locks. Inside the pen, which measured roughly 60 feet by 40 feet, 6 bulls moved in the fading light. Vandermeer began describing each bull, pointing them out with obvious pride. "That one there, the gray beast, that's Titan, imported from Spain, killed a man in 1845. Crushed his chest like it was made of paper, added from Spain, killed a man in 1845. Crushed his chest like it was made of paper, and that black one, the one with the scars, that's Goliath, Portuguese stock, responsible for 2 deaths. The others are equally dangerous. I keep them here as a reminder of what true power looks like. Strength without mercy, dominance without question." The guests murmured appreciatively, though several of them looked uneasy. These were men who understood violence and power, but there was something unsettling about keeping animals this dangerous for no practical purpose beyond display. As Vandermeer continued his presentation, Goliath began to show signs of agitation. The massive black bull started pawing at the ground, snorting, tossing its head. Then it charged at the fence, slamming into it with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that the entire fence shook, and several of the guests stepped back instinctively. Vandermeer laughed, clearly pleased by their reaction. "Don't worry, gentlemen. The fence is solid. These beasts can throw themselves against it all day and they won't break through. I had it built specifically to contain them." Goliath charged again, and this time the other bulls joined in, all of them rushing at the fence, bellowing with rage. The sound was deafening, a chorus of animal fury that echoed across the plantation. The guests were no longer smiling. Even Vandermeer looked slightly concerned, though he tried to hide it. "They're more agitated than usual," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. "Perhaps they sense the presence of so many people." And then, as if on cue, Tobias appeared. He had been working in the stable, which was located about 50 yards from the bullpen. He had heard the commotion and had come to investigate, thinking perhaps one of the horses had been spooked by the noise. He was carrying a bucket of feed, his work clothes dusty, his expression neutral. The moment Tobias came within 20 feet of the pen, everything changed. The bulls stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. They simply stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. Goliath, who had been in mid-charge, planted his hooves and stood perfectly still. The other bulls did the same. The bellowing ceased. The only sound was the evening breeze rustling through the pine trees. The silence was more unsettling than the noise had been. All 6 bulls turned to face Tobias. They didn't move toward him, didn't show any signs of aggression. They simply stood there watching him with what could only be described as focused attention. Their breathing slowed, their bodies relaxed. It was as if they had forgotten the fence, forgotten the men standing on the other side, forgotten everything except the presence of this one person. Vandermeer stared at Tobias, his face darkening. The guests looked between Tobias and the bulls, confused and fascinated. Colonel Hartley, who had drunk more brandy than the others and was feeling bold, laughed nervously. "Well, Baron, it seems your slave has more control over your bulls than you do. Perhaps you should have him give them their tour instead." It was meant as a joke, a light-hearted comment to break the tension. But the moment the words left Hartley's mouth, the atmosphere changed. Vandermeer's expression shifted from confusion to something darker, humiliation mixed with rage. The other guests fell silent, sensing immediately that something had gone wrong. Vandermeer turned slowly to look at Hartley. "Is that so?" he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone uncomfortable. Hartley, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack. "I meant no offense, Baron. I was simply commenting on the remarkable effect your man seems to have on the animals. It's quite impressive, really." But the damage was done. Vandermeer had been embarrassed in front of his peers, his authority questioned, his power diminished. And he had been embarrassed by a slave, someone who was supposed to be beneath notice, beneath consideration. This was intolerable. Vandermeer looked at Tobias, who had frozen in place, understanding immediately that something terrible had just been set in motion. Tobias's face remained neutral, but his eyes showed a flicker of something, not fear exactly, but recognition. He knew what was coming. "Tobias," Vandermeer said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Come here." Tobias set down his bucket and walked slowly toward the group of men. He kept his eyes down, his posture submissive, playing the role that was expected of him. But everyone watching could sense that it was a performance, that beneath the surface, Tobias was something other than what he appeared to be. When Tobias reached the fence, Vandermeer studied him for a long moment. The bulls remained calm, still watching Tobias, still ignoring everything else. "You have a gift with animals," Vandermeer said. It wasn't a question. "I work with them, sir," Tobias replied quietly. "I've learned their ways." "Learned their ways," Vandermeer repeated, his tone mocking. "How modest. Colonel Hartley here seems to think you have more control over my bulls than I do. What do you think about that?" Tobias said nothing. There was no safe answer to that question. Vandermeer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think we should test that theory. I think we should see just how much control you really have." The guests shifted uncomfortably. They could sense where this was going, and none of them liked it. "Baron," Thomas Fairfax said carefully, "perhaps we should return to the house. The evening is getting late and—" "Nonsense," Vandermeer interrupted. "The evening is just getting interesting. Gentlemen, I'm going to make a wager with my slave here. A generous wager, in fact." He turned back to Tobias. "Here's my offer. You will spend 3 days in that pen with those bulls. 3 full days. No food, no water, no shelter. If you survive, I will grant you your freedom and give you $50. That's more money than most free men see in a year. You'll be able to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. You'll be a free man." The guests were silent, shocked by the proposal. $50 was indeed a significant sum, and the promise of freedom was something that any enslaved person would desperately want. But the cost was almost certainly death. Everyone there had heard the stories about Vandermeer's bulls. 3 men had already died. The idea that anyone could survive 3 days locked in with those animals was absurd. "And if I refuse?" Tobias asked quietly. Vandermeer's smile widened. "Then I'll assume you were lying about your gift, that you're nothing special, just another slave who got lucky a few times, and I'll have you sold to a plantation in Alabama. I hear they work their people very hard there, much harder than I do. You probably wouldn't last a year." It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Tobias refused, he would be punished. If he accepted, he would almost certainly die. But there was a third option, one that Vandermeer hadn't considered. Tobias might actually survive, and if he did, Vandermeer would be forced to honor his word in front of witnesses or risk losing face among his peers. Tobias looked at the bulls, still standing calmly in the pen, still watching him. Then he looked back at Vandermeer. "I accept," he said. Vandermeer's smile faltered for just a moment, as if he hadn't expected Tobias to agree so readily, but he recovered quickly. "Excellent. We'll begin tomorrow at dawn. I want everyone on the plantation to witness this. It will be educational." The guests were quiet as they walked back to the main house. The evening's entertainment had taken a dark turn, and none of them were comfortable with what they had just witnessed. But none of them spoke up to stop it either. This was Vandermeer's property, his slave, his decision. To interfere would be to question his authority, and that was something none of them were willing to do. That night, word spread quickly through the plantation about what was going to happen. Workers gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating. Some thought Tobias was brave. Others thought he was foolish. A few thought he might actually survive, though they couldn't explain why they believed that. Marcus, the stable master, sought out Tobias in his room attached to the stable. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said. "We could find a way to get you out of here. There are people who help runaways. I know some names, some places." "No," Tobias said calmly. "Running would only make things worse. For me and for everyone else here. Vandermeer would take his anger out on all of you. But those bulls—" "I know," Tobias said. "I've known since the moment I arrived here that something like this would happen eventually. Men like Vandermeer, they can't tolerate what they don't understand. And they especially can't tolerate it when it makes them look weak." Marcus sat down heavily on a wooden crate. "So you're just going to walk into that pen and die?" Tobias looked at him, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not resignation, but something else, something that looked almost like certainty. "I'm going to walk into that pen," Tobias said quietly. "What happens after that? We'll see." The next morning arrived with a grey dawn, clouds obscuring the sun, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Vandermeer had ordered the entire plantation to gather near the bullpen. This was to be a public event, a demonstration of his power, and a warning to anyone who might think about challenging his authority. Over 200 people assembled in a loose semicircle around the pen. The enslaved workers stood in groups, their faces carefully neutral, knowing that any visible emotion could be interpreted as sympathy for Tobias and result in punishment. The overseers and managers stood closer to the pen, armed with rifles and whips, ready to intervene if the bulls somehow managed to break through the fence. Vandermeer's house servant stood near the main house, watching from a distance. Even Margaret had come out, standing on the veranda with her personal maid, her face pale. Vandermeer himself stood directly in front of the pen's gate, dressed in his finest clothes as if this were a formal occasion. Beside him stood Dalton, holding the keys to the gate's locks. Several of the guests from the previous night had stayed over, and they stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. To depart now would be to insult Vandermeer, and none of them could afford that. Tobias was brought forward by 2 overseers. He was wearing the same simple work clothes he'd had on the night before. Canvas pants, a rough cotton shirt, worn boots. His hands were unbound. He looked at the pen. "At the bulls moving, if you survive, you walk free with $50 in your pocket. If you die," he shrugged, "well, you should have been more careful around my bulls." A few of the overseers laughed, but the sound was forced, uncomfortable. Most of the crowd remained silent. Vandermeer nodded to Dalton, who stepped forward and began unlocking the gate. The chains rattled as they were removed, the sound loud in the morning quiet. The gate swung open with a creak of hinges. "In you go," Vandermeer said. Tobias walked forward without hesitation. He stepped through the gate and into the pen, his movements calm and deliberate. The moment he was inside, Dalton swung the gate shut and locked it, the chains rattling back into place. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The bulls, which had been moving around the pen, stopped and turned to look at Tobias. He stood near the center of the enclosure, not moving, barely breathing. His eyes were closed, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He looked like a man in prayer or in meditation, completely still, The crowd watched in tense silence. Some people were holding their breath. Others were whispering prayers. A few of the children who had been brought to witness this were crying, being shushed by their parents. Then Goliath, the massive black bull that had killed 2 men, began to move. It lowered its head, pawing at the ground, its muscles tensing. Everyone watching recognized the signs. The bull was preparing to charge. Several people in the crowd gasped. One woman screamed. Vandermeer leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Tobias, a slight smile on his face. Goliath charged. The bull rushed forward with terrifying speed, its hooves thundering against the packed earth, its head lowered, its horns aimed directly at Tobias. It covered the distance in seconds, and for a moment it seemed certain that Tobias would be gored, trampled, killed instantly. But then, just as Goliath was about to make contact, Tobias opened his eyes. He raised one hand, palm out, and made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a song, something in between. It was low and resonant, seeming to come from deep in his chest, and it carried across the pen with strange clarity. Goliath stopped. The bull's momentum should have carried it forward. It should have been physically impossible for an animal that size, moving that fast, to stop so suddenly. But Goliath planted its hooves and stood perfectly still, 3 feet away from Tobias, breathing heavily, staring at him with dark, liquid eyes. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Vandermeer's smile disappeared. He took a step closer to the fence, his hands gripping the iron bars. The other 5 bulls approached slowly, forming a loose circle around Tobias and Goliath. They didn't charge. They didn't threaten. They simply moved closer, their heads lowered, their eyes fixed on Tobias. Tobias stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised, that strange sound still emanating from him. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and took a single step toward Goliath. The bull didn't move. Tobias took another step and another until he was standing directly in front of the massive animal. He reached out and placed his hand on Goliath's forehead, right between the bull's eyes. The effect was immediate and profound. Goliath's entire body seemed to relax. The tension drained from its muscles, its breathing slowed and deepened. The bull closed its eyes, leaning slightly into Tobias's touch, like a dog being petted by its owner. The other bulls moved closer, surrounding Tobias in a tight circle. But there was no aggression in their movements. They were calm, almost gentle, their massive bodies moving with careful precision to avoid bumping into each other or into Tobias. Vandermeer stared at the scene, his face pale, his jaw clenched. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The bulls were supposed to kill Tobias within hours, if not minutes. Instead, they were acting like pets, like domesticated animals that had known Tobias their entire lives. "Give it time," Vandermeer muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "They'll turn on him when he sleeps, when he shows weakness. They'll kill him then." But as the hours passed, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. Tobias remained in the center of the pen, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting cross-legged on the ground, sometimes walking slowly in small circles. The bulls stayed near him, maintaining a respectful distance of a few feet, but never leaving. They didn't show any signs of aggression. They didn't charge the fence. They didn't fight with each other. They simply existed in that space with Tobias, calm and focused. By midday, most of the crowd had dispersed, returning to their work. Vandermeer had ordered that someone must watch the pen at all times, and workers took turns standing guard, reporting back on what they observed. But there was little to report. Tobias and the bulls remained in their strange tableau, hour after hour, as the sun moved across the sky. Vandermeer visited the pen 3 times that first day, standing at the fence, staring at Tobias with an expression that grew darker each time. He didn't speak. He just watched, his hands gripping the iron bars until his knuckles turned white. That night, as darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the pen so the guards could continue their watch. Tobias finally sat down, settling himself in the center of the pen with his back straight and his legs crossed. The bulls, one by one, lay down around him in a circle, their massive bodies forming a protective barrier between Tobias and the fence. They arranged themselves with their heads facing outward, like guards on watch. The workers who witnessed this reported it to Vanir, who came out to see for himself. He stood at the fence for over an hour, watching as Tobias sat motionless in the center of that circle of bulls, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. The bulls didn't sleep, or if they did, it was in shifts, because there were always at least 2 or 3 of them with their eyes open, watching the darkness beyond the fence. Vanir finally turned and walked back to the main house without saying a word. But those who saw his face said he looked like a man who had seen something that shattered his understanding of the world. The second day began with rain. Not a heavy downpour, but a steady drizzle that turned the ground inside the pen to mud and made everything gray and miserable. The workers who came to watch expected to see Tobias suffering, cold, wet, exhausted from a night without sleep. But when they arrived at the pen, they found something else entirely. Tobias was standing in the center of the pen, his face turned up toward the sky, his arms spread slightly as if welcoming the rain. The bulls stood around him in their protective circle, their bodies blocking most of the wind, creating a kind of shelter. And Tobias looked peaceful, not suffering, not struggling, but peaceful, as if the rain and the cold and the lack of food and water were irrelevant to him. One of the workers, a young woman named Sarah who worked in the main house, later told others that watching Tobias in that moment had made her cry, though she couldn't explain why. He looked free, she said. Even locked in that pen, even surrounded by those bulls, he looked more free than any of us have ever been. As the morning progressed, something strange began to happen. The bulls started moving in patterns, not random movements but deliberate, coordinated patterns. They would walk in a slow circle around Tobias and still for several minutes, and begin again. It looked almost like a dance, or a ritual. The workers watching were disturbed by this. It was too organized, too purposeful. Bulls weren't supposed to behave this way. They were supposed to be aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. But these bulls were moving with the precision of trained performers, and the only explanation anyone could offer was that Tobias was somehow directing them. But he wasn't giving any visible signals. He wasn't speaking or gesturing. He was just standing there, and the bulls were responding to something no one else could see or hear. Vanir came to the pen around noon, accompanied by Dalton and 2 other overseers. He looked like he hadn't slept. His clothes were rumpled, his hair uncombed, his eyes bloodshot. He stood at the fence staring at Tobias and the bulls, his expression a mixture of rage and something else. Fear, perhaps, or confusion. "How is this possible?" he muttered. "How is he doing this?" Dalton, standing beside him, shook his head. "I don't know, sir. I've never seen anything like it. Those bulls, they're not acting natural. It's like they're under some kind of spell." Vanir turned sharply to look at him. "Spell? Are you suggesting witchcraft?" Dalton looked uncomfortable. "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm just saying it's not natural. Bulls don't behave this way. Not without training. And even then..." Vanir turned back to the pen. "There has to be an explanation, a rational explanation. He's using some technique, some method of controlling them. Maybe sounds we can't hear, or movements we're not noticing. There has to be something." But as the day wore on, no one could identify what that something might be. Tobias continued his strange vigil, and the bulls continued their strange behavior, and everyone who watched felt increasingly unsettled. That afternoon, something even more disturbing occurred. One of the bulls, the brown one with scarred flanks that Vanir had named Brutus, approached Tobias and lowered its head until its forehead was touching Tobias's chest. Tobias placed both hands on the bull's head and stood that way for nearly an hour, completely motionless. The workers watching reported that during this time, Tobias and the bulls seemed to be breathing in perfect synchronization. Inhale together, exhale together, over and over, their chests rising and falling in identical rhythm. And more than that, the other bulls had stopped moving entirely. They stood frozen in place like statues, their eyes fixed on Tobias and Brutus, as if witnessing something sacred. When the hour was up, Tobias removed his hands from the bull's head. Brutus stepped back, shook its head once, and then returned to the circle. The other bulls resumed their slow, patterned movements, and Tobias sat down in the mud, cross-legged, his eyes closed, rain still falling on his upturned face. By the evening of the second day, word of what was happening had spread beyond the plantation. People from neighboring properties began arriving, asking permission to witness the spectacle. Vanir, who would normally have welcomed the attention, instead ordered the gates closed and guards posted to keep people out. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want this story spreading any further than it already had. But stories have a way of spreading regardless of what anyone wants. Workers from Vandermeer's plantation had family and friends on other plantations, and they talked. Merchants and traders who passed through heard the rumors and carried them to the next town. Within days, the story of the slave who had survived 2 days locked in a pen with 6 killer bulls was being told in taverns and churches and general stores throughout southern Georgia. Some versions of the story painted Tobias as a saint, blessed by God with the power to tame wild beasts. Other versions portrayed him as something darker, a practitioner of African magic, someone who had made deals with spirits or demons. A few people claimed he was a prophet, sent to deliver a message about the evils of slavery. Others insisted he was simply a skilled animal handler who had gotten lucky, but everyone agreed on the core facts. Tobias was alive, the bulls were calm, and something inexplicable was happening in that pen. On the evening of the second day, Vandermeer locked himself in his study and began drinking heavily. His wife, Margaret, tried to speak with him, but he ordered her away. The house servants reported hearing him talking to himself, his voice rising and falling, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, as if he were having an argument with someone who wasn't there. Around midnight, one of the house servants, a young man named Daniel, who was tasked with keeping the fires lit throughout the house, passed by Vandermeer's study and heard him shouting. Daniel paused, listening, and later reported what he had heard to others. He was saying, it's not possible, over and over, Daniel said. And then he said something about the bulls being his, about how he owned them, how he controlled them. And then he said, he's taking them from me. He's taking everything from me. And he sounded scared. I've never heard the Baron sound scared before. The third day dawned clear and bright, the rain having passed during the night. The ground inside the pen was still muddy, and Tobias was covered in it, his clothes, his skin, his hair. But he didn't look weakened. If anything, he looked stronger. His eyes were clear and focused. His movements, when he stood and stretched, were fluid and controlled. He looked like a man who had just woken from a restful sleep, not someone who had spent 2 days without food or water, exposed to the elements, surrounded by dangerous animals. The bulls, too, seemed energized. They moved with purpose, their earlier lethargy replaced by a kind of vibrant alertness. They continued their patterned movements, their synchronized walking. But now there was something almost joyful about it, as if they were celebrating something. Vandermeer arrived at the pen just after dawn, accompanied by nearly a dozen overseers and armed workers. He looked terrible. His face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking slightly. He had clearly not slept. He stood at the fence staring at Tobias, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Vandermeer said, his voice hoarse, "How are you doing this?" Tobias looked at him calmly. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just here." "That's not an answer," Vandermeer snapped. "Those bulls should have killed you. They've killed 3 men. They're dangerous, unpredictable, violent. But they're treating you like they trust me," Tobias suggested quietly. Vandermeer's face twisted with rage. "You're using some trick, some technique. Tell me what it is." Tobias was silent for a moment. Then he said, "There's no trick. I just understand them. And they understand me. That's impossible." "Is it?" Tobias asked. "Or is it just something you've never bothered to learn?" The comment hit Vandermeer like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "You dare speak to me that way? You're a slave, you're property, you're nothing." Tobias met his gaze steadily. "If I'm nothing, then why are you so afraid of what's happening here?" Vandermeer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood there, trembling with rage and something else, that fear that had been growing in him since this whole ordeal began. Finally, he turned and walked away without another word, leaving the overseers standing awkwardly by the fence. As the morning progressed, something unprecedented began to happen. Workers on the eastern edge of the plantation, near the boundary with the neighboring property, reported hearing strange sounds. The bellowing of bulls, but not aggressive or distressed. It sounded almost like calling, like the bulls were communicating with each other across distances. By midday, the reports had become more specific. Bulls from the neighboring plantation, owned by a man named Hutchinson, not stampeding, walking with purpose, as if drawn by something they couldn't resist. Hutchinson himself arrived at Vandermeer's gates around 2 in the afternoon, furious and confused. "Your man has done something to my bulls," he shouted at the guards. "They broke through a reinforced fence and they're heading this way. I want to know what the hell is going on." Word was sent to Vandermeer, who came to the gates looking even worse than he had that morning. When Hutchinson explained what had happened, Vandermeer's face went white. "How many bulls?" he asked. "5, Hutchinson said. 5 of my best breeding stock. They just left, walked right through the fence like it wasn't there. And they're heading toward your property, toward that pen where you've got your slave locked up. What did he do to them?" Vandermeer had no answer. He ordered his overseers to try to intercept the bulls, to drive them back to Hutchinson's property. But when the overseers found the bulls, 5 massive animals walking in a loose group through the pine forest, they couldn't turn them. The bulls ignored the overseers' shouts and whips. They simply kept walking, their eyes fixed on something in the distance, something only they could see. By late afternoon, the 5 bulls had reached Vandermeer's plantation and were standing at the gates, calm and patient, waiting. Workers tried to approach them, to lead them away, but the bulls wouldn't move. They just stood there, their attention focused on the distant bull pen where Tobias remained. And they weren't alone. Throughout the afternoon and evening, more bulls arrived. 3 from a plantation to the south, owned by a man named Crawford. 4 from a property to the west, belonging to a widow named Mrs. Pembroke. 2 from a small farm to the north. They came from different directions, different properties, but they all ended up in the same place, standing outside Vandermeer's gates, waiting. By nightfall, 14 bulls from neighboring properties had gathered. They stood in a loose group, not fighting with each other, not showing any aggression, just waiting, and every single one of them was facing the same direction, toward the pen where Tobias sat surrounded by Vandermeer's original 6 bulls. The plantation owners whose bulls had disappeared were furious. They came to Vandermeer's property demanding explanations, demanding compensation, demanding that he do something to return their animals. But Vandermeer had no explanations to offer. He stood on his veranda, staring at the gathered bulls, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "I don't know," he kept saying. "I don't know how this is happening." The other plantation owners didn't believe him. They accused him of using some kind of bait, some technique to lure their bulls away. Arguments broke out. Threats were made. The social structure that had seemed so solid just days before was fracturing, and at the center of it all was one man sitting in a pen with 6 bulls, doing nothing but existing. That night, Vandermeer didn't sleep at all. He paced his study, drinking brandy, staring out the window toward the distant pen. The house servants reported hearing him talking to himself again, his voice rising and falling, sometimes angry, sometimes desperate. Around midnight, Margaret finally forced her way into the study, ignoring his orders to leave him alone. "Wilhelm," she said, her voice firm, "you need to stop this. Let the man go. Honor your word. Give him his freedom and let this end." Vandermeer turned to look at her and she stepped back, frightened by the expression on his face. "Let him go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Let him go. Don't you understand what's happening? He's taking them. He's taking my bulls. He's taking bulls from other men's properties. He's doing something that shouldn't be possible, and if I let him go, if I admit that he's won, then everyone will know. Everyone will know that a slave defeated me, that I was powerless against him. This isn't about power anymore, Margaretti said. This is about survival. Your survival. Can't you see what this is doing to you? But Vandermeer wasn't listening. He turned back to the window, staring out at the darkness, and Margaret left him there, alone with his obsession. The third day ended at dawn on the fourth day, exactly 72 hours after Tobias had been locked in the pen. Vandermeer had given orders that the gate would be opened at first light, and a crowd had gathered to witness it. The enslaved workers, the overseers, several of the neighboring plantation owners whose bulls had disappeared, and even a few townspeople who had heard the stories and traveled out to see the conclusion. Vandermeer stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by Dalton and 4 armed overseers. He had ordered them to be ready for anything. If the bulls charged when the gate opened, they were to shoot. If Tobias tried to escape, they were to stop him. Vandermeer's face was pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his hands trembling slightly. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dalton stepped forward and began unlocking the gate. The chains rattled as they were removed, the sound loud in the morning quiet. The crowd held its breath. The gate swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Tobias stood slowly, brushing mud from his clothes. The 6 bulls rose with him, moving in perfect synchronization, their massive bodies unfolding with surprising grace. Tobias looked at the open gate, then at the bulls, then at the crowd of people watching him. He walked toward the gate, his movements calm and deliberate. The bulls followed, not aggressively, not frantically. They simply walked behind him, their heads lowered, their eyes focused on his back. They moved through the gate in single file, Goliath first, then the others, and they arranged themselves in a loose semicircle behind Tobias. The crowd stepped back instinctively, creating a wide path. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched as Tobias walked out of the pen and into the morning light, 6 massive bulls following him like obedient dogs. Tobias stopped a few feet from Vandermeer. The 2 men looked at each other, and for a long moment neither spoke. Tobias's expression was unreadable. Not angry, not triumphant, not afraid. Just knowing. As if he understood something Vandermeer never would. Something fundamental about the nature of power and control and what it meant to truly connect with another living being. Vandermeer broke eye contact first, turning his head away sharply. "Get him off my property," he muttered to Dalton. "Now." But before anyone could move, a sound rose from the direction of the gates, a deep, resonant bellowing. The 14 bulls that had gathered from neighboring properties were calling out, their voices echoing across the plantation. And then they began to move. They walked through the open gates, past the confused guards, past the gathered crowd, heading straight toward Tobias. When they reached him, they stopped, forming a larger circle around him and the original 6 bulls. 20 bulls in total, all standing calmly, all focused on one man. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. The neighboring plantation owners, who had come to reclaim their bulls, stared in disbelief. This was impossible. Bulls didn't behave this way. They didn't form groups like this, didn't follow a person like this, didn't show this kind of coordinated behavior. Vandermeer took a step back, his face white. "Stop him," he said weakly. "Don't let him leave with those animals. They're not his. They belong to me, to Hutchinson, to Crawford, to—" "They belong to themselves," Tobias said quietly, speaking for the first time since leaving the pen. His voice was calm but carried clearly across the crowd. "They always have. You just never understood that." Vandermeer's face twisted with rage. "You're a slave. You own nothing. You are nothing. Those bulls are property just like you." Tobias looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I was property," he said. "You promised me my freedom if I survived 3 days. I survived, so now I'm free. And these bulls—" He gestured to the animals surrounding him. "They've made their choice." "Shoot him!" Vandermeer suddenly shouted, turning to the armed overseers. "Shoot him and scatter those bulls." But none of the overseers moved. They looked at each other nervously, but no one raised their weapons. The sight of 20 massive bulls standing in perfect calm around one man was too strange, too unsettling. It felt wrong to interfere, as if doing so would break some natural law they didn't understand. Dalton stepped forward, his voice low. "Sir, you made a promise in front of witnesses. If we break that promise now, your word will mean nothing. Every man here will know you can't be trusted." Vandermeer looked around at the crowd, at the neighboring plantation owners watching him, at his own workers who had witnessed his promise. He was trapped. If he honored his word, he lost face by allowing a slave to defeat him. If he broke his word, he lost face by proving himself untrustworthy. There was, "Take your freedom, take the $50, and get off my property. I never want to see you again." Tobias nodded slowly. "I'll need the money in writing. A document stating that I'm free, signed by you, witnessed by these men. Otherwise, I'll be captured as a runaway the moment I leave here." Vandermeer's jaw clenched, but he knew Tobias was right. He turned to Dalton. "Prepare the papers, and get him his money." It took nearly an hour to prepare everything. Vandermeer's personal secretary was summoned to write out a formal document of manumission, declaring that Tobias was hereby freed from slavery and granted $50 as payment for services rendered. Vandermeer signed it with a shaking hand, and 3 of the neighboring plantation owners signed as witnesses, their expressions ranging from confusion to fascination. During this time, Tobias stood quietly with the 20 bulls surrounding him. Workers brought him water, which he drank slowly, and some bread, which he ate in small bites. The bulls remained calm, occasionally shifting position, but never straying far from Tobias. When the papers were finally ready, Dalton brought them to Tobias along with a small leather pouch containing $50 in coins. Tobias took the papers, read them carefully, then folded them and tucked them inside his shirt. He took the pouch and nodded his thanks. "Where will you go?" Dalton asked quietly. He had always treated Tobias with more respect than the other overseers, and there was genuine curiosity in his question. Tobias looked toward the east, toward the dense pine forests that stretched for miles beyond the plantation. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere we can live in peace." "We?" Dalton asked, glancing at the bulls. Tobias smiled slightly. "Yes, we." He began walking toward the road that led away from the plantation, and the bulls followed. They moved in a loose procession, some walking beside him, others behind, forming a protective formation around him. The crowd parted to let them through, workers and overseers and plantation owners all stepping aside, watching in stunned silence as this impossible parade passed by. Some of the enslaved workers reached out as Tobias passed, not touching him, but extending their hands as if seeking some kind of blessing or confirmation that what they were seeing was real. A few were crying, though they couldn't explain why. Others whispered prayers or made signs against evil, unsure whether what they were witnessing was divine or demonic. Tobias walked down the long dirt road that led away from the plantation, the morning sun rising behind him, casting his shadow and the shadows of 20 bulls long across the ground. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, steady and purposeful, and the bulls followed. Vandermeer watched from the veranda of his main house, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. His face was twisted with an expression that combined rage, fear, and something else, a kind of existential horror, as if he were watching the collapse of everything he believed about the world and his place in it. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his arm, trying to offer comfort, but Vandermeer didn't seem to notice her. He just stared at the distant figure of Tobias and his procession of bulls until they disappeared into the tree line and were gone. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at Vandermeer's plantation spread throughout Georgia and beyond. Newspapers picked up the tale, though they treated it with skepticism, suggesting that the accounts had been exaggerated or that there was some rational explanation that hadn't been properly investigated. Religious leaders debated whether Tobias had been blessed by God or cursed by the devil. Scientists and naturalists wrote letters to journals proposing theories about animal behavior and human-animal communication. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, no amount of skepticism or theorizing could change what they had seen. Tobias had survived 3 days with 6 killer bulls. 20 bulls had followed him when he left. These were facts, documented by dozens of witnesses, and no one could explain them away. The neighboring plantation owners whose bulls had disappeared were furious with Vandermeer. They demanded compensation for their lost animals, claiming that he had somehow lured them away or that his slave had used some technique to steal them. Vandermeer refused to pay, insisting that he had nothing to do with it, that the bulls had left of their own accord. The disputes escalated into lawsuits that would drag on for years, draining Vandermeer's finances and destroying his relationships with his peers. The social consequences were even worse. Vandermeer's reputation was shattered. The story of how a slave had defeated him, had survived his punishment, and walked away free with 20 bulls following him, became a source of mockery and gossip throughout the region. Other plantation owners began to question his judgment, his authority, his competence. Invitations to social gatherings dried up, business deals fell through. He became isolated, a man who had lost the respect of his peers. But the worst effects were psychological. Vandermeer became obsessed with understanding what had happened. He spent hours in his study, reading books about animal behavior, about African religions and folk practices, about anything that might explain Tobias's gift. He consulted with people he would have once dismissed as charlatans, root workers, folk healers, traveling preachers who claimed knowledge of the supernatural. He wanted answers, needed answers, but none were forthcoming. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. Workers reported seeing him walking the grounds at night, carrying a lantern, muttering to himself. He would stand by the empty bullpen for hours, staring at the ground where Tobias had sat, as if searching for some clue written in the mud. He stopped sleeping regularly, stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining the careful facade of control that had defined his public persona. Margaret tried to help him, tried to convince him to let it go, to move on. But Vandermeer couldn't. He had built his entire identity around the idea of control over his property, his workers, his animals, his world, and Tobias had shattered that illusion completely. If one man could do what Tobias had done, if the natural order could be disrupted so easily, then what did that say about Vandermeer's power? What did it say about the entire system he had built his life around? The plantation's productivity declined sharply. Workers whispered that the land itself had turned against Vandermeer, that crops were failing in fields that had always been fertile. Horses became skittish and difficult to manage. Even the dogs seemed nervous, barking at nothing, refusing to enter certain areas of the property. Whether these problems were real or imagined, the result of Vandermeer's declining attention to management or simply bad luck, they contributed to the sense that something fundamental had broken. About 6 weeks after Tobias's departure, a traveling preacher passed through Valdosta and stopped at a tavern, where he told a strange story to anyone who would listen. He claimed that while traveling through the backwoods of southern Georgia, he had encountered a man living in a clearing deep in the forest. The man was surrounded by bulls. The preacher counted at least 20, and they lived together in what could only be described as harmony. The bulls grazed peacefully, the preacher said, his hands shaking as he recounted the story, and the man moved among them without fear. I tried to approach, to offer Christian guidance, but the man looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through me. and I felt such overwhelming unease that I turned and fled. It wasn't natural. That man, he wasn't right. And those bulls, they watched me like they were guarding him, like they would kill for him if he asked. When Vandermeer heard this story, and he heard it quickly as gossip traveled fast, he became convinced that Tobias was practicing some form of dark art in the woods. He began making plans to find him, to confront him, to somehow undo whatever had been done. He talked about organizing a search party, about offering rewards for information, about forcing Tobias to explain his methods. But these plans never materialized. Vandermeer's mental state continued to deteriorate. He began experiencing what he described as visions, seeing bulls standing outside his windows at night, hearing their breathing, feeling their eyes on him even when he was alone in locked rooms. His wife and servants tried to convince him that these were hallucinations, products of stress and lack of sleep, but Vandermeer insisted they were real. "He's watching me," Vandermeer would say, staring out his study window into the darkness. "Tobias, he's out there with those bulls and he's watching me. He knows what I'm thinking. He knows what I'm planning. He won't let me rest." 3 months after Tobias's departure, on a humid July night, Baron Wilhelm Vanir locked himself in his study. He told Margrethe he was not to be disturbed, that he had important business matters to attend to. She had heard this before and knew better than to argue. She retired to her chambers, and the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet. The next morning, when the household staff knocked on the study door to bring breakfast, there was no answer. They knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Dalton was summoned. He tried the door and found it locked from the inside. He called out to Vandermeer. Silence. Growing concerned, Dalton ordered the door broken down. It took 3 men with a heavy beam to finally splinter the lock and force the door open. What they found inside would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Baron Wilhelm Vanir sat in his chair behind his desk, slumped forward, his head resting on his arms. At first they thought he had simply fallen asleep. But when Dalton approached and touched his shoulder, the body was cold and stiff. Vandermeer had been dead for hours. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no blood, no indication of poison or struggle. The room was exactly as it always was. Books on shelves, papers on the desk, a half-empty glass of brandy sitting nearby. The windows were closed and locked from the inside. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no way anyone could have entered or left. But it was Vandermeer's face that disturbed them most. His eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. His hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. Every muscle in his face was contorted in an expression of absolute, overwhelming terror. The doctor who examined the body could find no cause of death. The heart had simply stopped. "It's as if," the doctor said carefully, choosing his words, "he was literally frightened to death, as if he saw something so terrifying that his heart couldn't withstand it." On the desk, beneath Vandermeer's arm, they found a piece of paper. It was covered in frantic handwriting, barely legible, the words scrawled in desperate haste. Dalton picked it up and read it aloud to the others present. "They're here, all of them, standing outside the window, 20 bulls, just standing, watching, waiting. He's with them. Tobias. He's standing in the center, and he's looking at me. He's looking through the window, through the walls, through everything. He sees me. He knows. They all know. They're not moving. Just watching. Just waiting. I can hear them breathing. I can hear their hearts beating. I can hear his heart beating. It sounds like thunder. It sounds like the earth itself. They're not leaving. They're never leaving. They're going to stand there forever, watching, waiting until I..." The writing ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page as if Vandermeer's hand had simply stopped working mid-sentence. Dalton immediately sent men to check the grounds outside the study windows. They found nothing. No hoofprints, no tracks, no evidence that any animals had been there at all. The grass was undisturbed. The ground was dry and hard from weeks without rain. There was no physical evidence to support what Vandermeer had written. But 7 workers, independently and without consulting each other, came forward in the following days to report that they had heard something strange the night Vanir died. Around midnight, they had heard what sounded like distant bellowing, the deep, resonant calls of bulls. But when they had looked outside, they saw nothing. The sound had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing across the plantation like a warning or a judgment. One worker, an older woman named Ruth, who had been the plantation's cook, said something that others would remember for years afterward. "That sound," she said, "it wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, it was just there. Like the bulls were saying, 'We remember, we know what you did, and we're watching.' That's what it sounded like to me. Like a reminder that some things can't be forgotten, no matter how much you want to forget them." Baron Wilhelm Vanir was buried in the family plot on the plantation grounds. The funeral was small and awkward. Few of the neighboring plantation owners attended, and those who did left quickly, uncomfortable with the whispers and rumors that had surrounded Vandir's death. The preacher who conducted the service kept his remarks brief and generic, avoiding any mention of the circumstances of Vandir's final months. Margaret Vanir sold the plantation within 6 months. She couldn't bear to stay there, couldn't sleep in the house where her husband had died in such a disturbing manner. She returned to the Netherlands with what remained of the family fortune, which had been significantly depleted by lawsuits and declining productivity. She never remarried, and she never spoke publicly about her husband's death. When family members asked, she would simply say, "He lost himself. He became obsessed with something he couldn't understand, and it destroyed him." The plantation changed hands 3 times over the next decade. Each new owner reported strange difficulties, crop failures, livestock dying mysteriously, workers refusing to stay after dark, an overall sense of unease that pervaded the property. The main house, once so grand and imposing, fell into disrepair. The fields grew wild. The worker quarters were abandoned. Eventually, the property was sold for a fraction of its original value to a timber company, which clear-cut the forests and left the land barren. By the 1870s, all that remained of Vandir's plantation were a few crumbling foundations and the family plot where the Baron was buried. Even that eventually disappeared, overgrown by vegetation, the headstones toppled and broken, the names worn away by weather and time. As for Tobias, he was never seen again, not by anyone who could be considered a reliable witness. But stories persisted, passed down through generations, each version slightly different but all containing certain consistent elements. Travelers passing through the deep woods of southern Georgia occasionally reported encountering a man living among bulls in remote clearings. The descriptions varied. Some said he was young, others said he was old, some said he was black. Others said his skin had taken on a strange weathered quality that made his race difficult to determine. But certain details remained consistent. The man was always calm, always silent, and the bulls that surrounded him were always peaceful, almost reverent in his presence. Some said he had built a life in the wilderness, free from the world of plantations and bondage, living in harmony with creatures that others feared. Others claimed he was a ghost, a spirit that had never truly left the mortal world, doomed to wander with his strange companions for eternity. A few whispered that he had become something more than human, that his time in the bullpen had transformed him into a kind of guardian spirit for all animals that suffered under human cruelty. There was one account, recorded in a journal kept by a surveyor named Thomas Whitley in 1851, that stands out among all the others. Whitley was mapping territory in the remote backcountry when he came across a clearing he described as unnaturally perfect. A circle of grass surrounded by dense forest, as if the trees themselves had decided not to grow there. In the center of the clearing he saw a man sitting cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by bulls. Whitley counted 23 of them. The man looked up as Whitley approached, and Whitley wrote that he felt an overwhelming compulsion to stop walking, to go no further. His eyes, Whitley wrote, were not the eyes of a man who had suffered. They were the eyes of someone who had transcended suffering entirely, who had found something beyond it. I cannot explain what I felt in that moment, only that I understood without words that I was not welcome. Not because he bore me ill will, but because I did not belong in that space. It was his world, and I was merely passing through. The bulls watched me with the same calm attention, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I took another step forward, they would stop me. Not violently, necessarily, but they would stop me. So I turned and left. Whitley never returned to that clearing, and when he tried to find it again, years later, using his own maps, he could not locate it. The clearing, he concluded, had either never existed or had ceased to exist the moment he left. The story of Tobias and the 20 bulls became a legend in southern Georgia, passed down through generations. It was told in different ways depending on who was telling it and who was listening. To enslaved people and their descendants, it became a story of resistance and transcendence, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, there were ways to maintain dignity and power. To white Southerners, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating those they considered inferior, or a ghost story to frighten children. But everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever Tobias had done in that bullpen, whatever understanding he had reached with those animals, it was something that defied explanation. The witnesses were numerous and credible. The facts were documented. Baron Vandermeer's death was recorded in official county records. The disappearance of the bulls was confirmed by multiple property owners. These things happened. They were real. But the mechanism, the reason, the truth behind it all, that remains hidden, locked away in the same silence that Tobias carried with him into the wilderness, a silence that 20 bulls understood, but that no human ever could. In the end, we're left with questions that have no answers. Was Tobias born with a gift, or did he learn something in his years of suffering that others never could? Were the bulls drawn to him by instinct, or by something deeper, a recognition of kinship, of shared understanding between creatures who had both been broken and caged? And what did Baron Vandermeer see in those final moments before his heart stopped? Was it truly Tobias and 20 bulls standing outside his window, or was it something else? Guilt, fear, the weight of his own cruelty manifesting as a vision he could not escape. Was it a hallucination born of stress and obsession, or was it something more? Something that suggested the world is stranger and more connected than we understand. That cruelty and suffering leave marks that can't be erased. That some debts must eventually be paid. We'll never know for certain. The plantation is gone, reclaimed by forest and time. The people who witnessed these events are long dead. And Tobias, wherever he went, took his secrets with him. But sometimes, even now, people traveling through the remote backwoods of southern Georgia report hearing something strange in the night. A sound like distant bellowing, deep and resonant, echoing through the trees. And occasionally, in clearings where no one has built or lived for over a century, they find circles of flattened grass, as if large animals had rested there. But no tracks. No signs of how they arrived or where they went. Just empty clearings, and the lingering sense that something inexplicable once happened there. Something that changed the rules, if only for a moment. Something that reminded us that the world is stranger and deeper than we can ever fully understand. And that, perhaps, is the real terror. Not monsters or ghosts or supernatural forces, but the possibility that reality itself has cracks in it. Places where the normal rules don't apply. Moments when a man can walk into a pen with 6 killer bulls and walk out 3 days later with 20 following him like shadows. Moments when the impossible becomes undeniably, terrifyingly real. Moments that force us to question everything we think we know about power, about control, about the nature of consciousness and connection, and what it means to truly understand another living being. The story of Tobias and the 20 bulls is one of those moments. It happened. The evidence is there. But the explanation, that remains just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can never quite remember. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to exist as reminders that for all our certainty, for all our science and logic and rational explanations, there are still things in this world that we don't understand. Things that happened, things that were witnessed and documented, but that refuse to fit neatly into our categories and explanations. Things that make us wonder, late at night when we're alone with our thoughts, whether the world is really as solid and predictable as we like to believe, or whether there are cracks in the foundation, places where something else can slip through. Something older, something deeper, something that operates by rules we've forgotten or never knew. The story of Tobias is one of those cracks, and it remains open even now, more than a century and a half later. A question without an answer, a mystery without a solution, a reminder that some things once witnessed can never be explained away. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Tobias had a genuine gift, or was there a rational explanation that no one discovered? Could Vandermeer's death have been caused by guilt and fear alone, or was something else at work? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most unsettling mysteries, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember, the past is full of mysteries, and some of them refuse to stay buried.